Albert Ellis is one of the most renowned psychologists of our time. He is lauded as the grandfather of cognitive behavior therapy. In this presentation, I will highlight some of his greatest contributions to the practice of psychotherapy. It is notable that Ellis began to internalize behaviorist interventions before he reached the age of 20. As a child, he described himself as sickly and shy. After reading John B. Watson's work, at age 19, Ellis decided he wanted to cure himself of his own shyness. He sat on a park bench and approached 130 women, forcing himself to talk. As he described it, 30 walked away immediately. I talked with the other 100 for the first time in my life, no matter how anxious I was. Nobody vomited and ran away. Nobody called the cops. In a later interview, he described that his self-intervention allowed him to overcome his fear of social interaction. He approached his fear of public speaking the same way and eventually went on to become a successful, engaging speaker to packed audiences. His early appreciation of behaviorist principles seemed to foreshadow his later incorporation of behaviorist interventions into his work. This internationally renowned psychologist began his career in 2 other professions. He first pursued a degree in business, then decided that wasn't for him. He then dedicated himself to becoming a writer. While in his 20s, he wrote 20 complete manuscripts, including plays, novels, and nonfiction. Friends and family came to him with questions about the content of his writing, for example, sex, love, and marriage. He found that he was able to steer them in a helpful direction, which led him to, at the age of 28, decide to get a PhD in clinical psychology at the Teachers College at Columbia University. Though Ellis trained and started his career as a psychoanalyst in the 1950s, he rejected classical Freudian psychoanalysis. He found psychoanalysis to be devoid of a scientific basis, ineffective in terms of outcomes, and excessive in terms of the time spent in treatment. Characteristic of his bold personality, Ellis even went as far as to say unsavory comments about Freud himself, such as, "Freud unfortunately stuck with Martha his whole life, so he had no idea what to do with women to sexually satisfy them." Establishing his career in New York City amongst a professional community of psychoanalysts, Ellis began to innovate therapeutic practice. In 1955, Albert Ellis developed rational therapy in an effort to establish a more efficient mode of therapy. At the time, there were few behaviorist therapies, for example, Skinnerian and classical behavior therapy, and existing emotive therapies, for example, Fritz Perls' practice, tended to enhance feelings without distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy feelings. Ellis described that he could have called this new practice cognitive therapy, but he chose rational therapy instead, which he later described was probably a poor choice, because today, with postmodernism, nothing is completely rational or irrational. Historians say that the development of rational therapy was a catalyst in the cognitive revolution of the field. Rational therapy later became known as rational emotive therapy, to incorporate the emotional component of this practice. Ellis later renamed his practice Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy to emphasize the behavioral component of this practice. Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, or REBT, was the pioneering form of cognitive behavioral therapy that is widely practiced today. As Ellis later described, the purpose was to make therapy more efficient, profound, and to get the basic source of human disturbance. We wanted people to work hard rationally, emotionally, and behaviorally against the tendency to be destructive and to go back to their constructive tendencies, which they also have, and to finally lead to a more self-fulfilling and happier life. The mechanism of change for REBT is depicted here. This framework distinguishes healthy and unhealthy responses to a stimulus by considering whether the individual establishes rational or irrational beliefs about the activating experience. For those suffering from negative emotions generated by irrational beliefs, REBT can support individuals to dispute these irrational ideas, which leads them to establishing new, healthier beliefs, emotions, and behavior. Examples of irrational thinking include the following: encouraging rigid and dogmatic demands, for example, because I don't like what's going on, it absolutely shouldn't exist. Overgeneralizations occur when an individual generalizes negative interpretation of an activating experience to all experiences. For example, everything is awful. Catastrophizing includes an expectation of negative outcomes. For example, if I don't get what I want now, I'll always fail to get what I want in the future. Core irrational beliefs often include statements about what one should or must do. And by definition, irrational thinking leads to unhealthy emotions and behaviors. For example, anxiety, depression, rage, guilt, shame, and jealousy. In contrast, rational thinking includes cognitions that state preferences rather than demands. For example, I'd prefer to succeed and be lovable, but I don't have to. This type of thinking promotes frustration tolerance and unconditional acceptance of oneself, others, and life. Rather than overgeneralize or catastrophize, it encourages people to rate specific behaviors and events. Rational thinking is not bound by shoulds and musts, and by definition, it leads to appropriate, healthy emotions and behaviors such as concern, sadness, grief, healthy anger, and regret. Here's an example of the core ABCs of REBT at work. This poor man is getting broken up with after finding out that his girlfriend is now seeing another man. In response, he has a host of irrational thoughts. For example, I really must be a worthless person, and I'll never find another great woman like her. He develops depression and hostility. REBT helps him to dispute his irrational thoughts. He reframes his thoughts by thinking, where's the evidence that because this woman wishes to end our relationship that I am a worthless person, or that I'll never be able to have a really good relationship with someone else, or even that I couldn't be happy alone. After challenging his own irrational thoughts, his reaction to this difficult activating experience is now sadness and annoyance. The philosophy of REBT includes an assumption that all people have the capacity for distortions of perception that limit their own happiness, but they also have the capacity for change. As people cultivate awareness of the interconnections of their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, they have a choice. They can begin to monitor their own thinking, identify irrational thoughts, and dispute and replace these beliefs. Ellis, known for his provocative ideas and personality, also became famous for his bold therapeutic style and interpersonal style. He was direct, no-nonsense, obnoxious, audacious, charismatic, and a frequent user of very colorful language. Ellis found, especially when working with sex offenders and with people with other problems relating to sex, that using four-letter words with clients, quote, opened people up. He wrote several papers on this topic. Despite his direct style that often came across as abrasive, empathy was a very important part of his practice. He also recommended that REBT therapists not attempt to replicate his own style. He suggested that developing rapport and strengthening the client-therapist relationship was an essential component of REBT. Good REBT therapists combine active directive approach with humanistic respect for the client. Ellis was one of the most prolific psychologists in the history of the field. He worked with over 10,000 clients. He wrote 75 books, published over 800 articles, conducted thousands of speeches and workshops. He wrote on topics of psychotherapy, sexuality, love, marriage, culture, education, addiction, and executive leadership. Included on this slide are book titles displaying the range of topics he wrote on. His popular articles and media interviews helped to reach a larger mainstream audience. Indicative of his popular clout, Ellis received personal birthday wishes from two U.S. presidents, the Dalai Lama and the mayor of New York City. In 1986, the American Psychologist publication highlighted Ellis's major contributions to the field and noted that Ellis worked 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. 7 days a week, saw 70 individual clients, and led 6 group psychotherapy sessions a week well into his 70s. Ellis served as the founding president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality. He established the Institute for Rational Living, which later became known as the Albert Ellis Institute and is now a world training center for REBT. He also served as the president of APA's Division of Consulting Psychology and as a member of APA's Council of Representatives. He received the APA's Award for Distinguished Personal Contributions to Knowledge in 1985, and he also received the American Humanist Association's Humanist of the Year Award in 1971, which is an award also given to B.F. Skinner and Carl. To close, here's a quote that summarizes Ellis's approach to therapy. "The best years of your life are the ones in which you decide your problems are your own. You do not blame them on your mother, the ecology, or the president. You realize that you control your own destiny." Thanks for listening. Here are the resources that I used to prepare this presentation. Check them out. Thanks.